I didn't book the cruise for a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I booked it because it was cheap and because I needed to think about nothing for a week. I figured I'd drink coffee on the deck, read paperbacks, eat too much, and sleep like a kid. The ship looked like a floating hotel welded to a mall. It had a theater, a casino, 3 pools, and a grand staircase that tried too hard. The name on the hull was painted in thick white letters, Arcadia of the Blue. People took selfies with those letters behind them, while port workers hauled pallets of eggs and bottled water up steel gangways. I boarded with a duffel bag and a plan to not talk to anyone. Before we sailed, they herded us to the muster drill, the safety talk about life jackets and assembly points. I stood with 100 strangers under a canopy on deck 5, while crew in bright vests showed us how to loop a strap and pull a toggle. The heat collected in the canvas, and everyone's sweat hung in the air. People made jokes to their friends. A woman in front of me, nose sunburned, kept squinting toward the lifeboats. After the drill, the ship left port with a long horn blast that made my ribs vibrate. We slid away from the pier, past cranes and warehouses, and out into open water. The wind picked up the farther we went. I stood at the rail and watched the city soften and then flatten until it was only a line. The things on land became small and unimportant. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Relief. The first night was all buffet and music that sounded like it belonged in a dentist's office. The hot tubs were full. The main pool had a movie playing on a screen bigger than a house. In the casino, a man pounded a slot machine with 2 open palms like he was trying to wake it up. I wandered and kept my head down, letting the big machine swallow me and carry me along. In the lobby, a violinist was playing Yesterday and making it sound like a funeral. My cabin was on deck 9. Inside, there were 2 single beds pushed together under a painting of a generic coastline. The bathroom was a resin cubicle with a shower curtain that had its own opinion. When I lay down and turned off the light, I felt the steady secondhand heartbeat of the ship through the mattress. It was different from a car or a train. It was a low, patient thrum. It said, "I am alive." It said, "You are on me." The days slid by the way sea days do. They tried to sell me things every hour. Photos, specialty dining, shore excursions to places with names that sounded like they were chosen by a focus group. I avoided most of it. I walked the promenade in loops, watched flying fish jump in brief arcs, and drank coffee from paper cups while children chased each other between rows of loungers. I found a bar at the stern where the bartender didn't mind if you sat for a long time with a beer and said nothing. I started to notice the crew. Not their faces so much as their roots. A line cook with greasy cuffs rushing trays from a galley I never saw. A woman with a cart of towels who pushed it through a door marked "Crew Only" without looking left or right. A man in a jumpsuit stepping through a watertight door in a corner of a hallway, slipping out of sight like he was never there. The ship had veins I couldn't see. There were places that weren't on the deck plans, passages behind the show they put on for us. A boy went missing on the 3rd day. I didn't know it at first. I only noticed the announcement from the ship's office. It was a man's voice with an accent I couldn't place, friendly but firm. He asked the parents of a child named Theo to contact guest services right away. It came over the speakers in the hallway, then in the buffet, then again in the atrium, and then again a few minutes later. It repeated like an alarm that pretended not to be an alarm. People told each other what they'd heard. It was hard to tell how old he was from that one name. I heard guesses at tables near mine. 12, someone said. No, younger, said someone else. They said the ship had procedures for this, and it was fine. There were cameras everywhere. He'd turn up under a pile of towels, or asleep in a corner of the kids' club. People said this to each other because it was the kind of thing you say. I walked the promenade that evening. It was windy, and the horizon looked like a ruler, perfectly straight. Crew members in yellow jackets moved along in pairs. They didn't talk much. I realized I'd started to recognize some of them, the same faces in different places. The ship was a small town that pretended to be a city. You kept seeing the same people. I saw one of the yellow jackets duck into a door toward the bow and hesitated. The sign said, "No passengers beyond this point." The door swung shut, and the wind took a breath, and the ship's thrum kept going. The next morning at breakfast, they made another announcement for Theo's parents. The voice didn't sound alarmed. It sounded exactly like the first time. I thought about how you could train your voice to be a neutral color, no matter what you were saying. The woman at the next table said, "They should have locked the doors to the outside right away." She said it like she knew. Her husband nodded like he agreed with her, and had always agreed with her, and always would. I drank orange juice that tasted like it came from a box, and pretended to read while I listened for that voice again. Later in the afternoon, they closed the forward part of Deck 9 with a rope and a sign. It said maintenance. People stood there and took photos of the rope. It wasn't much of a barrier. The crew at either end of the rope had bored faces and hands clasped behind their backs. A child tried to duck under to make a point to his sister, and his father pulled him back and swatted his shoulder. I didn't see much of anything beyond the rope. Just another section of identical corridor, and a door that looked like every other door. I told myself to mind my own business. I made it to dinner, took a seat, and stared at a plate of pasta that had the texture of glue. Out the windows, the sunset was a ribbon. People clapped for a magician I couldn't see. The ship rolled a little, and the forks made a soft chorus as they slid an inch and then slid back. I felt the thrum through my elbows. And then I saw him. I didn't know it was Theo. But I saw a boy standing near the port side exit of the dining room, hands at his sides, head tilted like he was trying to listen to the carpet. He was maybe 10, with a clean buzz cut and a blue shirt that had the ship's logo on it, the way kids' club shirts do. He didn't look frightened. He looked like he was waiting for something that wasn't late. I made eye contact, just for a second, and he stepped backward and opened the door to the corridor. I followed. I don't have a better reason than that. It felt like a reflex you only figure out after the fact. The door closed on its pressure latch. The corridor outside was empty. The boy was already turning the corner at the far end. I walked faster. The ship had that hotel hallway quiet, thick rugs, recessed lights that never changed. I turned the corner and caught sight of him again. He wasn't running. He just kept a steady, unhurried pace like he had all night. "Hey," I said. "Wait." He didn't. I passed a stack of room service trays and the smell of cold gravy. I passed a cleaning closet with the door ajar, the chemical smell sharp enough to feel in my teeth. The corridor seemed longer than it had when I'd gone to dinner. That's a trick your head plays in unfamiliar places. Distance stretches and compresses like rubber. I told myself that, and I kept going. The boy slipped through a door at the end, the kind with no window and a bar across the middle. It was labeled Emergency Exit, Alarm Will Sound. The font was stern. I stopped 2 paces short. I didn't hear an alarm. I pushed the bar and opened the door a little and listened. Air moved. Somewhere below, something hummed at a different pitch than the ship's engines. The boy's feet on metal steps made a ringing sound, quick and light. And then that sound faded like someone turned a knob. I stepped through, let the door close behind me, and started down. The stairwell wasn't for guests. It was painted the color of a hospital hallway, and the corners had been hit with carts 1,000 times. Everything had a thin skin of scuff marks. I went down 1 flight and paused. Somewhere a fan turned and moved the air. I went down another flight and another. The ship had so many floors. You don't realize it from the top. I started to feel that pressure you feel when you move toward the bottom of something sealed. The boy's footsteps were gone. I listened for voices, for a radio, for anything. Nothing. I opened the door on the next landing and stepped into a different corridor. It was narrower. The carpet was gone, and the floor was painted with rough, non-slip texture. Pipes ran along the ceiling. It smelled like wet laundry in a dentist's office. I recognized a layout I'd seen in a documentary. The crew corridor that runs almost the whole length of the ship, secured behind doors. The spine that connects the service elevators to the galleys and the storerooms and the places they don't want you to see. I had walked into that. No one was there. That was wrong even before I understood why it was wrong. Back here there were always people moving, pushing carts, carrying stacks of trays, dragging hoses. But I could have rolled a bowling ball down the passage and not hit a thing. My footsteps sounded too high in the air. I kept moving because I didn't have a better option. The corridor went on. Doors without windows continued in a rhythm. The labels were dry and practical. Hotel stores, housekeeping, electrical. I checked the next flight of stairs. I took it down 1 more deck. The air changed again. It got cooler. The smell of water grew sharp. Through another door, a lower corridor. This one was unmarked. It had the same bones, welded steel, white paint, scuffed corners, but no labels, no arrows. The crew wayfinding stickers, those little laminated signs with codes and arrows, were gone, and the hum was different down here. It wasn't the even heartbeat I'd felt in my cabin. It had a wobble in it, a slow, tired lurch that vibrated in the drywall. I put my hand on the wall and felt it like a breath that couldn't quite settle. I told myself I should turn around. I said it out loud. It echoed. That made it feel silly. I walked. The corridor bent gently to the left, and then straightened, and then bent to the right. I passed a hatch with big dogs and a sign that had been painted over. I passed a stack of folded tarps and a coil of rope and a bucket of loose bolts. The way someone stores things they mean to sort later. I listened for the boy again. I didn't hear him. I stopped at a door with a porthole. It was the first window I'd seen since the dining room. The glass had a wire mesh embedded in it. I wiped it with my sleeve and left a smear. On the other side, a room with the look of an old lounge that someone had emptied. Built-in couches ran along 3 walls, covered with white sheets. A low table sat in the middle with a ring of cup water on it like a brand. The lights were on. There was no one in the room. The far wall had another door without a window. I tried the handle. It didn't move. My mouth had dried out. I swallowed and it hurt. When I turned around, a woman was standing at the end of the corridor. She wore the same yellow jacket I had seen earlier on the promenade. Her hair was pulled tight, and she held a radio in one hand with the antenna in the other, like it was a leash. She didn't look surprised to see me. She didn't look pleased either. She walked toward me without hurry, eyes on my face, and when she was close enough, she said, "You shouldn't be here." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." She waited. "I saw a kid," I said. "He went down." I tried to. "You need to go back to your deck," she said. "Sure." I felt like I had been caught somewhere I wasn't supposed to be as a child. "I didn't mean—" "Stay with me," she said. We walked back the way I'd come. Her radio stayed quiet. I heard a soft click once, like someone pressing a button and then not speaking. We went up one flight of stairs and then another. The air felt lighter even though nothing had changed. I could hear the muffled sound of a television through a door. I could hear a voice elevated in anger, and then calm again. The ship's hum smoothed out. That made me feel worse, not better. On the landing, she paused. "Don't come down here again," she said. "I won't," I said. "Not for any reason. I won't." She looked at my face long enough to make me feel like she was memorizing it. Then she pushed the door open and we stepped into a carpeted corridor with framed prints of seashells on the walls and a faint smell of air freshener. "Good night," she said, and started walking the other way. I watched her go. I listened to the door close. Then I went back to my cabin and locked the door, because I wanted to hear the click. And then I put the chair under the knob, because the click didn't help. I lay down fully dressed and stared at the ceiling and waited for the thrum to feel normal again. It took a long time. The next day, they didn't make the announcement. It was almost worse that way. People acted like they had decided to stop being worried. The little gossip loops untied. You could see the relief. It made me feel like I'd made it up. I did my rounds. Coffee, the Stern bar, the promenade. The water was flat as a countertop, and the sky had that wide, even blue that makes you feel like you're under a lid. Near the aft stairwell, I saw the yellow jacket woman again. She wasn't in her uniform. She wore a gray sweater and black pants, and carried a white plastic bag from the crew store. She met my eyes and then looked past me like she was looking at someone behind me, and that made me turn to see who it was. And when I turned back, she had gone through the door to the stairs. I went to the theater that night for a movie I didn't care about because I wanted to be in a room with a lot of people. I sat near the back. The ship moved in a slow, lazy way, and the screen's edges bowed a little with the roll. About halfway through, a light blinked at the back of the room, the kind of quiet light that's meant for crew. 2 people in dark clothes stood by that light and spoke to each other in low voices. One of them looked in my direction. It could have been nothing. I watched the movie until the credits, and then sat through the credits, because leaving would mean I had to walk into hallways again. After, I took the stairs down 2 levels to avoid the crowd. The stairwell was empty. Halfway between deck 7 and deck 6, I felt the ship shudder in a way that didn't match the swell. It was a short, hard tremor that shook my knuckles on the rail. The lights didn't flicker. The stairwell didn't move. But the sensation went through me like a cough. I waited a moment. Then I kept going. Deck 6 was quiet. The carpet swallowed my steps. The air was cool and dry. I passed a door marked crew only, the same as 100 others. And as I passed it, I heard a child's voice on the other side say something I couldn't make out. The door was solid, but the voice came through as a shape of sound. I stopped. The voice spoke again. I heard the shape of the words, but not the words. I reached for the handle and lowered it. The latch clicked. The door eased inward, slow, like it had to decide whether it wanted to open. The corridor on the other side was dark. An emergency light near the floor gave it a weak gray glow. The child's voice had stopped. The air felt colder. I listened for a crew member, a vacuum, a radio. A light down the hall buzzed. In that buzzing was a slow pulse I felt in my teeth. I took a step in and let the door close behind me. "Hello," I said. My voice hung there like I'd thrown it, and it didn't know where to land. I walked toward the light. The corridor tilted slightly to the left, and then back. That might have been the ship, or it might have been me. On the right, a metal door had a round handle and a painted label that had been sanded away, leaving only a white rectangle. On the left, a narrow door stood half open into a small room with 2 bunks and a metal locker. The room was empty, except for a plastic bag full of bottles on the floor. The labels on the bottles were in a language I didn't recognize. The tops were taped shut with blue painter's tape. At the end of the corridor, the buzzing light hung over a door with a keyed reader beside it. The reader had a green light, the kind that says, "You may." But the door itself had a thick slider across it like a bolt, and the slider was locked in place with a small padlock. The padlock looked new. Someone had written numbers on it with a marker. The numbers had smudged. I didn't know what I expected to find if I kept going. A kid in a blue shirt, standing and waiting like he had the other night. Someone to explain to me why the ship had rooms without names and doors with new locks and corridors with no crew. What I got was water. It came under the bottom of the door and across the floor in a line, as clear and quiet as a living thing. The ship wasn't listing. The sea outside wasn't rough. This was not the slosh of a wave finding a crack. It was water moving with intent, a thin sheet that found my shoe and flowed around it and kept going. It was colder than I thought it would be. I stepped back and left a dry footprint where I'd been, and the water slid over the footprint and erased it. I felt something like panic turn its head toward me. I turned and walked away, careful not to slip. The door I had come through was not where I thought it was. The corridor took me left when I expected right. I passed the bunks again. I told myself I had just turned around twice without noticing. I kept that story because I needed it. I found the door and the reader and the green light, and then the red one, and then my own reflection in a small square of steel, and finally the push bar and the carpeted world beyond, where the air was dry and the lighting was soft, and the ship had a pulse a person could live with. Back in my cabin, I looked at my shoes and the line of damp on them, and thought about how much water it would take for that to feel normal. The answer didn't calm me. I slept in short bursts. Each time I woke up, I felt like the ship had moved. Not in the way it always moves, in a different way. When I opened the bathroom door, the mirror had a new fog bloom around the edges that slid away as I watched. The sink smelled faintly of metal and something that made me think of a dentist again. I ran the tap and let it clear, and then ran it longer. On the 5th day, most people on board had surrendered to the routine. They wore the ship like a loose shirt. They waited for trivia and the midday show, and then the pool games. The missing boy didn't come up much. I sat by the stern bar and looked at our wake. The water behind us stayed organized far longer than it should have. Lines in it holding, shapes that kept their edges when they should have blurred. When you stare at a wake long enough, your eyes give you patterns. I told myself I was doing that. That afternoon I walked to the bow. That part of the promenade went under the lifeboats, and the shade made the air feel cooler. A door ahead was held open with a rubber wedge. Through it, another door. Beyond that, a space I hadn't seen. It looked like an observation lounge, but wrong. The ceiling was lower, the couches lower, the shape tighter. There were windows, but they were covered from the outside with something like canvas, and the light came through dim and blue. It felt like being under a tarp. No one was in the lounge. There was the smell of stale coffee and something sweet gone off. On the low table, someone had left a handful of red wristbands in a plastic cup. The wristbands had serial numbers. The numbers didn't match. On the wall, a TV hung with a black screen. Mounted under it was a little box with a green light and a red. The green was steady. The red ticked off and on like a heartbeat. There was a sound like a fan, but slow, and the fan that made it wasn't moving. On the window canvas, water moved. At first I thought it was rain, sheets of it pulled across the outside. Then I realized we were between ports, and the weather was clear. The canvas had the shape water makes when it's pressed against it, not from above but from the side, and the shape slid across as if something leaned there and then leaned away. The print of it made me think of a face, but not in the way people see faces in toast. It had the proportions of a thing that wasn't like us, and looking at it made a part of my head go quiet. I left that room. I stepped backward with stupid care, like backing away from a sleeping dog you don't know. In the corridor outside, the air tasted dry again. A crew member in a blue polo turned the corner, saw me, and startled like I'd just come out of a closet he didn't know was a closet. He recovered quickly, smiled, and said, "Please, this area is for crew." He said it with the exact rhythm of a sentence he'd said many times. "I'm sorry," I said. I got turned around. He looked past me once and then nodded. "Happens," he said. "Enjoy the afternoon, sir." He stood there until I was moving and he could watch me go. That night, the wind came up. The pool sloshed up and down with the ship's roll and then sloshed over. They closed it and stretched a net across. The net billowed like a chest. People got seasick and the staff handed out little green bags. The ship's thrum took on a thicker texture, like the sound of a breath through a cold. I went to bed early and woke to the alarm that wasn't called an alarm. The voice on the speakers was the same friendly, firm voice. He said there was a technical matter being handled by the engineering team. He asked us to remain in our cabins for the moment. He said there was no cause for concern. He said it in 3 languages. I got up and put on my shoes with their salt line dried pale on the leather. I listened. A soft footfall like rain moved through the ceiling. I told myself it was the sound of people walking on the deck above. I told myself it was the sound of water in pipes. The light in my cabin went from white to that odd yellow white they use when they don't want you to see true colors. The bathroom mirror had a film on it that my palms smeared and made worse. My cabin door handle turned. The door opened 2 inches and stopped against the chain. A hand in a blue latex glove reached in and lifted the chain off the slider in one practiced motion, and the door opened. The yellow jacket woman from the lower deck stood in the hall with a man in a white shirt and dark tie. She didn't have the jacket now, but there was a badge on her shirt with a photo that didn't quite match her face. The man had a clipboard. He had that cruise director smile. "Good evening," he said. He had the friendly voice exactly. "We're doing a quick check of guest accommodations." "What kind of check?" I asked. I heard how that sounded and tried to make it light. "I mean, I can get my towel animals in order." He smiled as if I had made a joke he intended to like. "It'll be brief," he said. He glanced at the woman. She stepped past me and looked at my bathroom, my bed, the ceiling, the floor. She did it fast, eyes flicking to the corners people don't think about. She didn't touch anything. She sniffed once like the air had something in it you could pick up if you were trained. The man checked off a box. "Did you use your shower this evening?" he asked. "No," I said. "Any unusual smells? Anything from the vents?" "No," I said. "Everything smells like someone cleaned a lot." He laughed at that. The woman didn't. She looked at the vent over my bed and watched it like she could see through it. "Thank you," the man said. "We apologize for the inconvenience." "Is this about the kid?" I said. They both looked at me as if I had asked for steak in a shoe store. "What kid?" the man said, in the tone of a question that was also a denial. "The one from the announcements," I said. He smiled in a new way. "All guest matters are handled with privacy in mind," he said, which meant you won't hear about it, which also meant it exists enough to be private. They left. I closed the door and put the chain on, even though I'd seen how little that mattered. The lights went back to their regular white. The alarm that wasn't an alarm turned into a message about the show in the theater and the late-night buffet. The ship rolled and sighed. When I woke in the early morning, we were at a port. The sun was low and the sea was flat. The dock workers drove little trucks that beeped when they backed up. A fuel truck with a long hose was connected to the ship, and men watched the connection like it was a bomb they trusted. People lined up at the gangway with day packs and hats, happy to see land, happy to step off and shop for magnets. I decided to stay on board. That's a thing people do. You get the ship to yourself. I walked the quiet decks. I went to the forward observation lounge, not the weird one, the other one, with the big windows and fake plants and a coffee machine that spat out drinks with foam. From the window I could see the dock, and beyond that, a town with low buildings and red roofs and streets that went off at angles that made no sense to me. The mountains behind it looked like cardboard cutouts painted blue. In the corner of the lounge, a crewman put a wet floor sign on a patch of carpet that wasn't wet. He looked tired in a way that went past shifts. I asked for a coffee. He pushed a button for Americano, and then pushed it again when it stopped halfway through, and then smacked the side of the machine with the back of his hand in a motion he had practiced. The cup filled. "Thanks," I said. "Welcome," he said, and held my eyes a beat too long. There was something like a request in that look, but I didn't know what it was for. And when he realized I didn't know, he looked at the floor and pulled the sign a little to the left. I took my coffee to the quiet lounge and drank it, and tried to think about land, to anchor my head there. It didn't stick. I kept seeing the lower corridor, and the water under the door, and the way the yellow jacket woman had looked at my vent, as if the ship might breathe through it. When people started returning in the late afternoon, they brought sun with them, and plastic shopping bags with bottle-shaped shadows, and stories about beaches and food, and a church with a painting that looked like it was crying. The ship took them in, counted them, and made a noise I hadn't heard before. A low, chuffing cough like someone clearing their throat. The lines went away. The horn sounded once. We pulled out. That evening at dinner, I asked a waiter if the ship had a library. He said yes with relief, as if I had asked for something he could deliver. He pointed me toward a quiet corner on deck 11. After dinner, I went up there. The library was a narrow room with shelves and a few puzzles, and a little desk with a sign-out sheet that no one had used. The books were the kind people leave behind. Thrillers with shiny covers, romance novels with couples in the rain, a travel guide from 10 years ago. I pulled a paperback at random and sat by the window and tried to care about a detective who couldn't sleep. Someone walked by in the corridor outside and then stopped and came back and leaned in the doorway. It was the yellow jacket woman. She wore a sweater again, but the badge was still there, a small rectangle that caught the light like a warning. She didn't come in. She looked at the shelves and then at me. I put a finger in my book like I was holding my place. We didn't talk. She was the one to look away this time. She continued down the corridor. When I got up and stepped out to watch where she was going, she was already gone. That night I didn't sleep. I lay there and tracked the ship's movements by what things in my cabin clicked and shifted. A hanger in the closet ticked against the wall. The bathroom door made a throat sound. The vent made a fine white noise that hid other noises, maybe on purpose. In the middle of all that, I heard footsteps in the corridor that were too light for adults and didn't break stride at my door. They went past and then stopped, and then went back the other way. I got up and put my ear to the door. The footsteps paused on the other side. I didn't open it. I went back to bed and stayed there with my eyes open. I woke to another announcement about a technical matter, which somehow sounded like the same words as before, and also like a new thing they were trying to say as if it wasn't the same thing. A tray of breakfast was outside my door. I hadn't ordered it. There were 2 covered plates, a glass of juice, a domed lid with a yogurt under it, a small note, folded, with my cabin number on it, and a smiley face. The smiley face didn't fit the handwriting. I brought it in and put it on the desk. Steam lifted from one of the plates and made a small cloud. I didn't touch it for a while. When I did, the eggs had gone rubbery. By late morning, the sky darkened. The horizon had edges again, not the straight line, but a jagged one with a storm behind it. The ship moved a little differently, a slow bow-to-stern flex that made the glasses in the bars slight moan. I went to the promenade to walk. The wind cut past the lifeboats and made a sound in the lines that was almost a song, but not in a good way. Crew in rain gear walked with purpose. A door I'd never seen open was open. Through it, a room where they stored folded deck chairs wrapped in gray straps. A radio on a shelf in that room crackled. I heard the word intake, and then a static cough, and then the word lower. I kept walking. I didn't want a crew member to see me looking. In the afternoon, the wind went from strong to hard. The ship threw a shoulder up and then down, and the pool water knocked against its net like a thing that wanted out. The lights stayed steady. The announcements stuck to entertainment and specialty dining. The storm outside revealed itself one muscle at a time. People who had been drunk an hour ago were sober. The crew handed out the little green bags again. I went back to my cabin. There was a dampness in the carpet by the bathroom door that made my sock wet through. I crouched and pressed my fingers to it. It wasn't enough to be a leak. It wasn't shaped like one. It was a wide area, cool, as if the ship had exhaled. I dried my fingers on a towel and looked at the vent. The vent looked back. I took the chair from under the desk and jammed it under the door handle again. It wouldn't help. I did it anyway. In the evening, the ship went quiet. Not the good quiet. The engines kept on, but the other noises fell away. The music, the public laughter, the braying announcements about bingo. It was all still there, technically, but it was like someone had put glass over it. The air felt heavy, and if you moved your hand, you could feel the weight, as if the ship had lowered the pressure inside itself. I didn't know why I thought that, but I did. A knock came at my door. Not loud, not urgent. A polite uniform knock that told you a person in a uniform would be on the other side. The cardio machine in my chest fired up. I went to the door and looked through the peephole and saw a fisheye version of the yellow jacket woman. She had on neither the jacket nor the sweater. She wore a plain white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and stubbornness in her shoulders. "Open," she said, not loud. I opened the door. "You need to come with me," she said. "Why?" My mouth was dry and the words stuck. "You asked why?" she said softly, and that shook me. "Because it's time to not be on this deck." "What does that mean?" She looked over my shoulder at the vent. She looked at the damp patch by my bathroom. "It means," she said, "that the place we keep between places isn't there anymore." "That's not a sentence," I said, like a child, "because fear makes you say things like that." "Shoes, jacket," she said. I grabbed my shoes. I didn't ask how she knew I had a jacket. Everyone had a jacket. I followed her into the hall. There were other people out too, all with a crew member. Not many. A family with a sleepy girl. An older couple holding hands like they were about to cross a street. The crew guided us without drama. We walked to the stairs. We went down one deck. Not up to the lifeboats. Down. "Shouldn't we?" "Please," she said to me. "Keep moving." We went through a door that I wouldn't have opened if I'd been by myself. The air past it had that cold spring smell again. The corridor was lit, but the light was wrong, like it came from under things instead of above them. The other crew led their people through doors beyond. The yellow jacket woman kept me with her. We turned left and then right, and then left again, and the walls felt close, and the thrum of the ship fought with something lower, like a second engine starting underneath the first. "We are not going below the waterline," she said, as if I had asked. "We are not going to an unsafe place." "Okay," I said. I didn't believe her, or not believe her. I just put my feet where she wanted them. "Do you have family?" she asked after a while. The corridor bent, and a door with a wire glass window went past on my right, like a mouth you didn't want to look into. "No," I said. "All right. What about the kid?" The boy I had seen in the dining room. His blue shirt. The way he had looked at the carpet like he was listening to it. She took a longer breath before she answered. "He is in the count," she said. "What does that mean?" "It means he's part of us now," she said, "which is a thing that happens. He will be where we are. That's the best I can say." We stopped at a door with no label. She had a key, not a card, a real key, old and heavy, with teeth. She unlocked the door. Inside was a room that looked like an old lounge again, but this one had people in it. Not many. A few crew, a few passengers, the family with the girl, the older couple, a young man with a sweatshirt pulled up over his mouth. There were no windows. There was a smell like air from a can. The hum in here was different again. A narrow thing like a flute. "What is this?" I asked. She didn't answer me. She looked at a man in a jumpsuit who sat by a table with a diagram on it. He nodded once. She turned back to me. "You're going to stay here," she said. "You're going to sit. If anyone knocks, you don't open. You wait until someone with this," she touched her badge, "comes back." "What's happening?" "The ship has places in it that are not for the ship," she said, as if she were telling me the address of a dentist. "Sometimes they line up. We keep them from lining up. We soften the edges. We make corridors where there were stairs. We lock doors that used to be doors. It's what it is." "You're talking like—" "I'm talking fast because I have to leave," she said. Her eyes looked tired now, the kind of tired that doesn't sleep out. "Listen to me. We don't say these things to guests, but you walk in places you shouldn't, and you look at vents, and you go through staff doors because you think you don't count as a problem." "I didn't." "You did," she said, "but it wasn't unkind. It was the way you talk to someone who has stepped in the street and needs to get back on the sidewalk. Sit on that couch. When you hear the shift up," she pointed to the ceiling, "you can go. Not before. Will the ship—" I didn't know how to finish that sentence. She didn't either. Or she did, and didn't want to. "The ship will keep doing what it's doing," she said. "It always does." "How do you know that?" "Because I'm still here," she said, and left. I sat. The couch had been reupholstered at some point, and the new cloth didn't match the old foam. It sighed when I leaned back. The older couple across from me looked at me, and then looked at each other and squeezed hands hard. The family with the girl gave her a phone with a game on it, and the pixels reflected in her eyes. The young man in the sweatshirt watched the door and didn't blink enough. The crew in the room didn't talk. One of them counted something under his breath and then started again. Time went sideways. The hum in the room changed pitch, and then changed back, and then didn't. At some point, the air went colder, and someone tucked a blanket over the girl. The door made a small sound, like a person clearing their throat, and nobody moved. If you didn't know human bodies, you would have thought we were calm. I wasn't calm. My jaw ached from clenching it. There was a taste in the back of my throat like I had licked a coin. Eventually, the ceiling made a different sound. It was nothing anyone would pay attention to if they were in a normal room on a normal day. A shift. A lightness. The crew in the room all looked up at the same time. The man at the diagram stood. He nodded. The yellow jacket woman wasn't there. Another crew member, a man with a shaved head and eyes that belonged to a kinder face, said, "Okay." He opened the door. The corridor outside looked like a corridor should look. The air felt regular. The hum of the ship felt like a big cat purring again, and not like a tired thing struggling. We filed out. They took us up 2 flights, and then up 1 more, and then to a door with a push bar. And then we were in a public hallway with seashell prints, and a woman talking too loud about the salad she'd just eaten. I felt like I had trespassed back into the world. The crew thanked us for our patience. They had faces like nothing had happened. The older couple walked toward a bank of elevators without letting go of each other. The family with the girl went the other way, and the girl looked back once like there was something she had left behind that she didn't want to admit she missed. I went to the stern bar. The bartender I liked saw me and didn't say anything. He poured me a beer without me asking. I sat and looked at the wake and told myself the patterns were only water. The sun broke through something on the horizon and turned the surface into crushed glass for a while. And that should have made me feel better. But it made me feel like the ship had won a small argument with something that would be back for the rest of the conversation. That night, the show in the theater went on. People clapped too hard. The ship wore its smile. I went back to my cabin. The damp patch by the bathroom was dry. The mirror had only the fog you expect after a shower, and it cleared. The vent made its normal hiss. I lay down. I slept. In the morning, I woke to sunlight. We were at sea with a new port ahead, a thin line of land. I showered and went to breakfast and ate too much and drank coffee and told myself to be a person who minds his own business. The announcements talked about a sale on watches and a trivia contest about movies from the 80s. I walked the promenade and watched the sea make its perfect, forgetful motions. Near the bow, I saw the yellow jacket woman. She leaned on the rail in a way that said she had been on ships long enough to know how to lean, so the ship did some of the work. She saw me and nodded once. Not a hello, not a goodbye, not permission, not warning. I stood next to her, not close. The wind had an edge that wasn't cold and wasn't warm. It was just an edge. "Is he going to stay?" I said. She didn't answer. She looked out at the water. I looked at the water too. The ship cut its usual path and the sea closed behind it like it always does. There was no sign of anything that didn't belong there. That's the trick. The sea is very good at erasing. After a long minute, she said, "When we go to port, we count. We count on the way off. We count on the way on. We count trays. We count towels. We count people. We count again. The count always comes out." "That's not what I asked," I said. I didn't put anger on it. I wasn't angry. I was tired. There are kinds of tired you can sleep out. This wasn't one. "I know," she said, "but it's the answer you can carry." She pushed off the rail and left. I watched the water until my eyes watered. I went to the library and read the last third of the detective book and forgot it immediately. I took a nap in a chair under a fake palm. I woke to a woman laughing in a way I didn't like because it didn't match anything funny. I walked the ship's loops. I avoided the doors with crew only, and I listened to the vents only enough to not hear them. On the last night, the captain made a speech about what a pleasure it had been to have us on board. He had a voice that said he had made that speech many times and would make it many more. He thanked the crew by department. People clapped in ways that showed who had had more drinks. He said we'd be back in port early in the morning, and that disembarkation would go by color-coded tags. He asked us to put our suitcases outside our doors by midnight. He made a joke about forgetting your passport, and people laughed because you have to laugh at that. I went to my cabin and packed. I left the painting of the coastline where it was. I sat on the bed and put my hands on my knees and pressed down and felt the ship under me and listened to the thrum, like you listen to a sleeping thing breath, to make sure it still is. I put my suitcase outside the door. The hallway smelled like shampoo and air that has been in too many lungs. I locked the door. I didn't put the chair under the handle. I lay down. Sometime in the night, I dreamed about the lounge with the canvas over the windows. I dreamed about the print of water pressing from the side and the shape it made that wasn't a face, but my head thought of faces anyway. In the dream, there was a handprint inside the canvas, but not the shape of a hand I know. I woke with my heart going hard and sat up and looked at the vent. And it was just a vent. And the thrum of the ship was patient again. And I went back to sleep. In the morning, we were at the pier. People lined the corridors with their suitcases and their tired, thin smiles. We shuffled toward the gangway, like we were in a line to be born. The crew smiled and told us they hoped we had a wonderful time. The yellow jacket woman wasn't there. I thought she wouldn't be. I reached the scanner and put my card on it, and it beeped in a way that said I existed in their system and could leave. I stepped onto the gangway, and it flexed under me. The port smelled like diesel and baked concrete and pastries. On land, the ground felt too still. I took a breath that wasn't ship air. It didn't make much difference. I rolled my suitcase toward a taxi. The driver asked where I was going. I said the name of my hotel. He drove. The sun was bright and the city was loud and the ocean kept being the ocean a few blocks away like it had all the time in the world. In the hotel room, I stood in the shower for too long. I lay on a bed that didn't hum. I turned on the TV and let it talk to me until I couldn't hear the ship anymore. That took a while. I slept. When I woke, the afternoon was moving toward evening. I looked at my phone without unlocking it. Then I unlocked it and checked the news and saw nothing, and checked again and still saw nothing. I didn't know what I expected. An article about a technical matter, a line about a boy. There wasn't anything. There never is. Ships don't write about what happens to them when the lights are dim. In my bag, at the bottom where the wheels make little black marks, I found a red wristband. It had a serial number in black. The number wasn't smudged. It wasn't the same as any of the numbers I remembered from the cup, but I'm not sure I remembered them right. I held the wristband in my palm. It was warm from being in the bag. I put it on the desk and looked at it until it was just plastic again. I went to the window and looked at the slice of sea visible between two buildings. It looked like it was doing what it always does. I know better now. That doesn't change anything. I still sleep sometimes with the vent on in my apartment, even when I don't need it. The noise helps. The hum is wrong, but it's the wrong I know. On good nights, it's easy to forget. On bad nights, I hear light footsteps in the hall, and the careful knock, and I don't open the door, because I'm not on the ship, and the door is not a door in a corridor that goes places it shouldn't. When I think about the yellow jacket woman, I think about how she carried the radio like a leash. I think about the man at the diagram. I think about the way the crew moved with purpose and pretended it was for maintenance. I think about the last thing she said to me, the answer I could carry. I put that answer in my pocket and touch it sometimes like a stone. I've looked up the Arcadia of the Blue without finding anything worth reporting. The photos look the way all cruise ship photos look. Pretty lights and food that looks like it might taste good. The comments say things like fantastic crew and great value. There's a picture of the staircase. If you zoom in, you can see a bit of a vent over a doorway in the background. It's just a vent. I leave it alone. Some afternoons, when my apartment is too quiet, I go for a walk and end up by the waterfront. There's a bench that looks over the ferry terminal. The ferries go and come, and the water makes those wakes that fold up behind them like origami. Sometimes a ship is out there, moving slow, a city moving to another city. I watch it until it is too small to watch, and then I go home. And on the way, if I pass by the service entrance to a big hotel, and the door swings open, and I see the corridor behind the scenes, that bright sterility, that scuffed paint, I keep walking. I don't go through doors that say crew only anymore. That feels like superstition until it doesn't. If you want a moral, I don't have one. If you want an answer about the boy, I don't have that either. At least not one that will make anything easier. I have the thrum in my head that sometimes lines up with my pulse and sometimes doesn't. I have the memory of a canvas with water pressing the wrong way. I have a red wristband I don't wear and don't throw away. And I have this. When you are on a ship, you are inside a thing that knows you are inside it. That's not a fancy thought. It's only a fact. You can forget it while you eat and drink and watch a movie. But the ship doesn't forget. It is patient. It hums. It counts. It keeps its own list of doors, some of which are not on any plan. If you catch the wrong door on the wrong day, and the clamps are tired and the edges are soft, you might find yourself between places. If that happens, and someone in a yellow jacket tells you to sit and not open, listen. Carry the answer you can carry. Leave the other one where it belongs. I don't like fishing alone anymore, but some habits stick like fish smell on your hands. I still keep the old milk crate with my tackle under the bench seat of the tin boat. Still fold the life jacket so it won't make my back sweat. I still listen to the burble of the little two-stroke and count it like beads until the motor warms and the sound smooths out. The lake and I used to have an understanding. Now when I go out, I feel like a guest who's overstayed. The first time I went to Osprey Lake this year, the ice had gone not long before. There were bands of dark and light water where the wind pushed the cold around, and the birches were just opening up into green smoke. The launch was empty. That used to be a good thing. Nobody to curse at the ramp. Nobody cutting across your line. Now emptiness feels like having a problem you don't want help with. I don't blame the lake for anything. I tell people that if it comes up, they nod. I can see them thinking of the story in whatever version they heard. The standby. A man and his brother out in a little boat. Storm comes up. Something goes wrong with the motor. One swims, one doesn't. But it wasn't like that. We were on the dam face, not even far out. We were sober. We had life jackets. I was closest. I still don't blame the lake. But I also can't sleep if I hear rain hit the eaves. The boat rasped off the trailer rollers and slid into that dull green water. If you fish long enough, you learn the lake's moods, and that morning it had the blunt look of early season. No weeds up yet, no dragonflies skimming, the banks raw with melt. Sound carries different over cold water. It goes farther, but it dulls sooner. You hear the motor running on the far side, then nothing. You hear a loon, and your brain gives it a location that isn't real. I took my time. I let the outboard idle and kicked the bow around with the oar until I was lined up with a seam in the water where the sun made a kind of tin foil shine. I tied on a jig with a white paddle tail and a stinger hook, because if the pike are lazy early, they nip short. I always forget my glasses when I don't want to think too much, so I had to spit on my fingers to pinch the braid clean enough to thread it. The knot ran down and locked with that little crackle sound braided line makes. I checked the drag with 2 fingers, upgraded it half a click. That's the kind of thing that used to make me happy. Tiny control. The first cast felt like waking up. You know when your body remembers how to do something without you teaching it again. The rod loaded and I let the jig go on a low sidearm and watched the line peel, green against gray, and then stop and sag in that little bow that tells you it found the water. I counted down. 10 seconds, maybe 12. The water was cold and deep. There was no reason for any fish to be up. I started the retrieve slow, bumping bottom. 2 cranks, pause. The jig head ticked rocks and then drew off into the silty part, and I could see the bow and the line flatten. I didn't think. I let the rod tip dip, and then I snapped it up and set. The fish wasn't big. It shook the way a small pike shakes, frantic and all bone. I brought it in green, because it didn't matter if it shook the hook at the boat. Early season, catch and release, let it go easy. It came up clean, silver green, water pouring from its cheeks, and the jig buried just in the corner lip. A good place. I slipped the barbless out and the fish hung there a second, surprised, like it had been told something personal. That pause gets me. It feels like the moment before a person decides whether they're going to cry or get angry. Then it slid back and spooled away into the green, and I saw my hand shaking a little when I shook the water from it. First fish of the year always shakes me. I was glad for the feeling. It meant I was still a person. The next one was bigger. The third was a surprise walleye, pale as a ghost where the color hadn't come back from winter. I took it as a good sign. The wind came up a touch from the west, and the lake went into small creases that caught the sun. An osprey cut across, easy. It was a normal morning, the kind you don't tell anyone about because it would sound like nothing. I moved spots the way I always do on that lake. Run the edge of the deep flat until it lifts to the old river channel, then look for where a winter blowdown makes a comb that breaks the current. There's not much current in a lake like that. Not really. But water moves, even when you think it doesn't. And fish feel it on their sides the way we feel a mood walk into a room. I don't know if that's science. It doesn't matter. A fisherman turns into a scientist the same way a gambler turns into a mathematician. It's all a way to make the world feel like it runs on rules. I was sitting with my knees against the thwart, working another jig along a drop, when I felt the boat settle. That's the only way to say it. The weight changed. Maybe a wind shift. Maybe a little standing wave under the hull. I looked up because sometimes you pick up something in the corner of your eye. A loon surfacing. A beaver hump. There was nothing. No, that's not right. There was a piece of wood floating about 20 yards off the bow. A torn hunk of bark caught under it like a dead mouth. It's not unusual this time of year, stuff breaking loose from the shore. But I knew it. Or I knew that shape. That's the problem with a body that learned a thing it doesn't want. It sees it everywhere. I forced my eyes back to the line, back to the tick of the jig, back to the little vibration you feel in your palm through a decent graphite rod, the thready hum like a tuned string. I could pretend to be the person I'd been. I brought the jig up, and a fish followed it. I couldn't see the fish, but I felt the cold lift in the line where water sloughed off its head. It took at the last second, right under the surface, and blew water in a little soft bloom. I set again, and the rod went hard, and then I felt it. Something that wasn't a fish. The line shuddered, and the weight didn't pull. It sank. 2 summers ago, braid saved a reel. That's something I said a lot later, because it was easier than describing the sick weight. It sounds practical. I hooked the line with the paddle tail, and now I had a problem. Something heavy had taken the jig. I figured it was a log, or someone's anchor rope, or the metal lip of a can wedged in old concrete. I leaned back and kept the rod low, and breathed the way you do when you know you're about to lose tackle. The line sawed once, twice, and then sang down the guides as whatever it was slid off and came free. It came up slow, faster than a log, slower than a fish, a weight that adjusted to me. When it broke surface, I had a blank space where a reaction should be. It was a rope, or it was line, nylon, pale and slick, coiled around something dark. It was old and fuzzy in places where algae had grown on it. It turned and showed a loop like an eye. I wanted it to be anything else. I said a word I never say when I'm alone, and pulled the boat backward with my feet against the hull, and the thing went under again, the line ticking in my palm. Light, like a finger tap you pretend you didn't feel. I cut my line. I did it quick and clean. I let the braid snip with that light crackle sound and watched it reel back and disappear. Then I took the knife to the end and trimmed it back an inch more, because that kind of clean end makes me feel like I've put something back in order. I told myself it was only rope, only a bundle. People drop crab trap line and anchor lines, and it picks up stuff and twists into knots. The lake had pushed something at me and I'd pushed it away. That's all. The thing about telling yourself stuff like that is that it always holds for a few minutes, and then the part of you that catalog details starts up again. That pale fuzz on the rope isn't algae so much as silt fungus. That loop wasn't an eye. It was a noose, or the beginning of one. The dark in the coil wasn't a log. It had edges. Stop. I said it out loud. It didn't do anything. I could hear my voice on the water, weak and flat, dead as minnows in a bucket left in the sun. I tried to fish normal for another hour. I moved to a different arm of the lake, put a point of land between me and the spot. I switched to a spinnerbait because the flash and thump are easy to believe in. I called in a fat pike that hit like it owned the place and shook its head until the spinner came out and threw an arc of water into my face, and I laughed because that's how you laugh when you nearly start crying. My hands kept busy. Tie, retie, cast, slow roll. Watch the rod tip, then the water, then your watch, then the line again. Eat one of the gas station sandwiches you swore you wouldn't buy anymore. Take too big a bite and breathe bread in your lungs. By noon, the sun had bite to it. The wind kicked harder, and the tin boat began to slap. You can ignore the slapping a while, Then it gets personal. Each hit is a finger under your fingernail. I told myself to pack it in, that I'd done my penance, that I could go home and wash my hands and do a few chores and sit with the dog while he made his contented throat noises. It sounded like a plan a human would make. I set the rod on the floor and turned to the motor to yank the cord. I didn't mean to look back, but maybe we all do. I looked, and there it was again, in the V of the wake behind the transom, coming up the way a fish follows, straight and patient, as if my boat were a lure it meant to take when it was ready. The same coil, the same pale line. Farther back, something darker, not floating exactly, more like held. I jammed the choke and yanked the cord harder than I had to. The motor racked and coughed and then caught, and I swung the nose toward the launch and opened it up. Tin boats don't go fast, but they hurt when they hit a wave wrong. I let it hurt. I stood up on my knees a little to take the slap in my thighs. When I risked a glance back, the thing was gone. I told myself that it had never been there. When I got to the dock, there was a truck parked in the lot that hadn't been there when I launched. The back was piled with brush, and a blue tarp tied over it with yellow rope. The rope had that same pale look. Of course it did. All rope looks the same if you want it to. Two guys in orange hats stood by the grill at the picnic table, and a woman sat on the tailgate with a soda. They were laughing. You know how other people's laughter can sound like a language that excludes you? That was this. I didn't want to show any part of my brain to theirs. I knew that if one of them asked how I did, I'd tell them too much. I winched the boat up, tied it off sloppy, didn't even strap the stern. I left the launch feeling like I was trying to leave a dog that keeps following the truck, a slow, relentless guilt jogging behind the bumper. At the stop sign, I checked the rearview mirror. There was nothing but road and my motor bouncing on its bracket and the slow waggle of a loose strap. I pulled over and cinched it. I was sweating, and the sweat smelled like the lake, copper and old leaves. Back home, the dog did make his throat noises, and I did wash my hands. The braid had stained my fingers a little green. It does that. I scrubbed until the paint on the bathroom sink chipped. When I stopped, I realized I'd been crying. It was stupid, and I was glad the dog didn't know. He looked at me and squinted the way he does when the sun hits the kitchen floor just right, and he's deciding whether to move. I gave him a piece of bread and told him he was a good boy. That part felt real. I tried to nap in the chair and couldn't. When I closed my eyes, the pressure of the rod butt against my wrist came back, and the tick of the braided line translated into a different kind of feeling. The way your body misfiles things sometimes. It was like a tooth wiggle. It was like checking if a scab is ready to come off. I kept putting my tongue to a place where there wasn't a tooth. I don't have a missing tooth. I stopped breathing and realized I was holding my breath the way you do underwater. I went back out the next morning. That's where this stops being about the lake and becomes about me. I could say I went because it was a good bite window, or because the wind would be right, or because that was my day off. I went because if I didn't, I'd have life in my house that was only furniture, and a dog, and my own head. And my head is a bad room to be in. If I'm going to sit with a bad room, I'd rather do it over water. The morning had that thin blue flannel light, cool and soft, the kind that feels borrowed. The launch was empty again. The same two gulls stood with their feet in the scum line and studied the surface like they were reading news. I kept the motor at half and let the boat groan as it planed up. I went back to the same arm because pretending not to is pretending to be someone else. At the spot, I dropped a small marker buoy because I wanted a piece of plastic to assure me I wasn't drifting far. It's a silly thing. A little triangle buoy with a cord that unreels and an ounce of lead. I could have used the map in my head, but I wanted something to look at that wasn't water. I set up the drift, killed the motor, and felt the boat slide just so. Then I tied a new jig. I used a Palomar knot instead of the improved clinch. It felt like cheating on a ritual. I told myself it would hold better on braid. I told myself all sorts of things. The first half hour I didn't pick up the rod. I let the boat move and watch the wind's patterns. There are foils on the surface you can't see until you stop trying to see them. The way a breeze from the north will push a slick from the south back on itself, and they fold and make a seam that looks like a long animal. I watched the seam until my eyes unfocused and the animal breathed. I picked up the rod. The line caught the light. I flicked the jig out and it fell, and I started the same old crawl. The vibration filled my palm again. It felt like an apology I wasn't ready to hear. When the tick came, it was sharp. I set clean. The fish ran at me and out past the boat, and then turned and the line went slant, and something gave a slow, deliberate pull. Not fish, not log. The pull of a person who has something to tell you and will not be rushed. I don't say my brother's name easily now. We were fine together. Not close, the way people make families into myth. We shared the kind of language that lives in small gestures, the way you can read a person's shoulder before they say they're done for the day. He was better at knots than me. He could drive the trailer straight every damn time. He had a way of lowering a stringer into the water like he was apologizing to the fish for keeping them. The day he died, he was laughing about a stupid joke I made about minnows. It was nothing. It was the sort of nothing that follows you everywhere and taps you on the neck when you get quiet. The line pulled again, and I let it take. The boat moved a little, sideways. The marker buoy drifted across my left eye, and I grabbed it with my foot before it went under the hull. The line shuddered, and then I felt it in the handle, down the hollow of the rod grip. A series of small taps. Not 3. Not a number. Just enough to make my teeth feel loose again. Just enough to make my throat go hot with the effort of not calling a name. I leaned the rod low and let the line run, then palmed the spool and made it stop. If you've used braid long enough, you know how it transmits tiny things. The line hummed. The hum wasn't vibration anymore. It was like a mouth warmed the line all along its length. I felt breath where no breath could be. The water was cold enough to bite your fingers, and I felt warmth against my palm. People talk about seeing things. They talk about hearing their name called. They talk about cold spots. None of that has ever mattered as much to me as the feeling of something that isn't there, leaning weight into your hand the way a body does when it's standing next to you at the rail, and they let their shoulder touch yours. Just a little. The line went slack. There are things you don't want to look at. If you look, you have to go all the way. If you don't, you'll go anyway, and you'll lie about why. I let the rod tip drop and reeled up the slack. The jig came back too fast. I slowed, expecting to see the lure plain and stupid under the surface. It didn't come. The line went tight again, just a touch. I leaned. Something surfaced beyond the boat, 2 rod lengths off, not a rope this time. Not quite. It was a length of something pale under the water, the shape of it like a forearm, the water streaking past it. It was wrong. It was more wrong than anything I've seen. Not because of what it might have been, but because of what it did to my sense of size. It wasn't big. It wasn't small. It was exactly the size of the piece of my life it wanted. I'm aware of how that sounds. I'm trying to keep it simple. It turned. No, the water turned it, and something slipped over it like a skin you could put over a shape to understand it. It was knotwork, loops and half hitches, braid over braid. It made an arm out of rope. It made a wrist. It made my hand. I put the rod down very carefully. I set it so the butt wouldn't bang. I reached for the oar. I wanted to move the boat without noise, like quiet would make me less visible to water. The oar creaked in the lock exactly the way the oar always does. There isn't a way to make it not creak. I pulled against the water and the boat slid, and the line I had cut yesterday emerged from the surface, green and clean, its end cut at an angle I recognized. It hung in the air for an inch, 2 inches, as if something beneath were unwilling to let it go of a story it wanted to keep telling. I cut my line again. I cut it too close because my hands had started their small tremor, and I misjudged the tension. The end snapped back and kissed my knuckle. I sucked a little blood. It tasted like the smell of the lake. I sat there with the cut in my mouth and the knife in my other hand, and counted my breaths until the part of me that wanted to throw the knife in the water got bored. I went home. I didn't fish. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't sleep. There are sayings about people drowning. If you know, you know. The first time you watch someone vanish, your brain lets you make excuses for the laws of physics. They'll pop up behind the boat. They'll stand up, because the water there isn't deep. They'll grab the life ring you threw. You tell yourself stories so fast you don't notice you're doing it. Then you stop telling stories, and you watch the air where they were. If you're honest, you remember that you were also listening for the slap of a fishtail, because every light on the surface is the same for a second. I kept going back. I'm not proud of it. It wasn't brave. It wasn't healthy. It was what I could think to do. I brought the old fish finder and clamped it to the transom and ran the transducer over the side and watched the tiny screen print out bands and squiggles that might be weeds or rocks or fish or nothing. I told myself that if I could make a map of the bottom, I could make a map in my head where nothing human belonged. I told myself that if I dropped a marker every time the screen showed a drop-off, I might build a little picket fence of buoys and keep the bad part out. The third morning, I launched, and the wind had gone around, and the lake had white flecks where the wave tips blew off. I kept to the lee of the shore and let the boat push crabwise along the line of a reed bed that hadn't grown yet. The fish finder showed a hard bottom turning soft. A hard, soft edge is good. I took a deep breath and made a cast parallel to the reeds, telling myself about edges and forage and ambush points, so I wouldn't feel like I was praying. The line pulled. I set. For a second there was fish on, the wobble, the dart. Then the rod went heavy. I lifted and the weight lifted with me and then sank, and my forearm started that ugly lactic ache. I let the drag give. The braid sang. A gull passed overhead and laughed, because gulls always sound like laughter, and I decided I hated gulls. The fish finder made a small beep, because it thought it saw something. The screen printed a shape that looked like a hook turned backward. I don't know why that got to me. The idea of the hook backward, as if something had consented to be taken. The line stopped in the water, as if it had reached a limit. I couldn't reel. I could pull and gain an inch, 2 inches, and then lose it. The boat drifted toward it. I put the rod between my knees, braced, and reached for the oar. I sculled a little to the side, trying to change the angle. The line creaked. It creaked. You don't hear braid creak. It made the sound of wet wood under strain. It came up. It came up smooth, the way a big carp will come up when it's tired, and just lets the line do the thinking. The surface lifted and rounded, and then something pressed through, rope and silt, and the pale sleeve of a shirt that wasn't there. It was an arm in negative. It was everything my hands had done on that lake for 30 years, tied into a shape that said, "This is what you've been practicing for." I didn't say a name. I should have, maybe, but I didn't. I reached out. My hand met the water above the shape, and it was warm. I don't know how to make that plain. The water under my fingers had a skin of warmth on it, like a person had just lain there. I pressed down, and the shape pressed up. I could feel resistance. You get used to the give of water. This was not that. This was the give of a body. I tried to lift. I don't know why. I just did. And then the line cut sideways, and the shape uncoiled, and the boat yawed, and the rod butt slammed into my thigh, and the marker buoy slipped under the hull, and the line tangled it, and the buoy dove, pulled a foot under, bobbed, dove again. The little triangle buoy looked suddenly stupid, a toy next to a thing that had a plan. The boat pivoted, and I lost balance and sat hard on the bench, and the oar went out of the lock and slid, and I clawed it back purely because I didn't want it to be in the water with that. The dog was not there. He was at home. That fact hung in my head like a bell that had just been struck. It had a note. It said, "There is nothing between you and this." It said, "You asked for this when you came out here alone." It said, "You could have stayed home and watched the morning people talk about the weather. You could have made coffee and looked at the spider web in the kitchen window and left it alone out of courtesy. Instead, you came out here to make sense out of a place that eats sense." The line went slack. The buoy popped up and listed, rope burned through. The fish finder beeped again, and the screen showed nothing. A blank run with only the bottom line and the little numbers marching on. My hands were shaking with an old shake now, the shake that had been saved for special occasions. I looked at the pale patch of water where the shape had been. The surface had a bruise there. I reeled in slow, expecting to find my jig gone, or the leader frayed, or the hook bent. The jig came back perfect. The skirt was clean. The knot sat neat against the eye. That offended me. It felt like I'd been corrected for using the wrong word. I think this is where I should say something like, "I decided to leave," or "I vowed to stay," or "I prayed." None of that fits. What I did was change lures. I tied on a dead stick rig with a soft jerkbait that looked like a smelt. I let it fall and sit. I watched the line lay flat on the surface and then sink a fraction as water soaked it. I told myself no fish could resist, which is something liars say. I told myself a lot of things, and none of them mattered. When it came again, It came without movement. The line simply ceased to be slack. It grew a direction, as if someone had taken hold of the far end and started walking back into the trees. Not fast, not slow, just with purpose. I lifted the rod and it bowed. I could feel the blank engage, every fiber working. Graphite sings when you load it right. It sang like a low note. The line hummed again, and I told myself it's just friction over the guides. I told myself all kinds of little mechanical truths to stack between me and the bigger thing. Then it tugged back the way a person tugs to get your attention. It wasn't strong. It was polite. It said, "I'm here." I did the stupidest thing I have ever done. I answered. I gave a small tug, a mirror of it. If you've ever worked a jig with a fish in cold water, you know the slow ping-pong of it, the conversation and pressure. That's what this became. Tug, tug. I felt my face go hot with shame in the middle of the lake. I felt like I was flirting with a thing that had worn my brother's shadow around long enough to make it smell like him. "Okay," I said. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could make it into a ritual that would follow rules. Maybe I thought if I spoke, I'd anchor myself. The line moved again, not toward me, not away, just angling off into the main basin where the water goes dark, and then darker, and then the lack of light becomes a substance you could smooth threads into. "Okay," I said again, and the line moved a third time, and this tug had a cadence in it that made my teeth hurt. I let go of the oar, and it knocked the hull, and the noise went out over the water like an announcement, like a bell. The wind dropped. It does that sometimes on lakes. The trees barely moved. The gulls shut up. Even the hiss of the reeds lost its edge. My boat took on the feeling it gets right before the storm line crosses the ridge, as if the air wasn't going to help me anymore. I wish I could tell you I had a plan. What I had was a feeling my feet weren't where they should be. The boat had drifted while we tugged at each other. I was farther from shore than I thought. The fish finder read the same depth for a long string of seconds. The tiny number crawled to a higher number. The jerkbait sat somewhere down there, and so did the thing, and my line ran from my wrists to that place, as if I were handcuffed to it. I set the rod in the holder. I did it slow, because letting go felt worse than holding on. Then I stood and edged to the bow and pulled the anchor. People don't use anchors on little lakes that much. I do. I like knowing I can stop. The rope burned my fingers a little because I wasn't paying attention, and the little mushroom anchor came up with its spine of silt and a circle of weed around it like a crown. I let it clunk into the boat, and the sound made a shape on the water that then faded. I counted my breaths again, not because it helps, but because it's something to do that isn't running. "Okay," I said a third time, and I sat back down, and I took the rod out of the holder, and I pointed it straight at the line and wound down. The line drew in. It drew in like reeling in a kite on a windless day. It came, but it didn't. It resisted, but not enough to give me a roll. I don't remember deciding to cut the line. I remember the relief of the braid's little crackle when it went. I remember the way my body relaxed into a shape I hadn't felt in years. The shape of a person who could say no. I let the tag end fall into the water. It lay there for a second. A little green snake on the surface. Then it slid under. Not like a weight took it, but like it chose to go. I left. I motored in slow, and I didn't stand up on my knees this time to take the chop in my thighs. I let the boat slap, and it didn't hurt. It felt like being hit in a fight. You're not going to win. and realizing you can decide where to put your face. I got to the dock, and there was a boy there with his grandmother. He had a Zebco and a worm bucket, and his tongue stuck out of the side of his mouth in concentration while he tried to thread a hook through dirt. He looked up at me and saw my face, and looked down again, the way kids do when they see something about adulthood they don't have words for yet. At home, I hung the life jacket on the nail in the garage and let it drip. I washed the boat. I changed the line on my rods and put the spent braid in the trash. I sat with the dog. I drank water. I breathed. A normal day. A normal day with the part of it that wasn't normal sitting in the middle like a rock in a child's pocket. Too heavy for the cloth to hide the shape. You want me to say whether I went back. You want the shape of the story to close. You want to know if I made peace, or lost something final, or pulled a human thing from a non-human place, and gave it a name and put it in the ground. What I will tell you is that I started to hear the line again when I wasn't on the water. I heard it in the hum of the fridge at night. I heard it when the dog shook his ears and his tag hit his collar, a delicate metal tick, like a knot tightening. I heard it in my own jaw when I chewed. I would reach for a glass, and my hand would pause a fraction before the grip, as if I had to wait for a signal from the other end of the line. I bought a different brand of braid. It didn't help. I tried monofilament because monofilament is forgiving. It stretches, it hides, it gives you a second chance. The sound changed, but it was still there. I put away my rods for a week. I didn't sleep during that week either. I dreamed I could feel the weight of the lake pressing up through the mattress. Taut, like a line not yet tight, but ready. There are practical options. You can sell the boat. You can move. You can learn a craft and keep your hands occupied in colors that aren't water. I tried whittling and made a small knife handle that gave me a blister. I tried running and my knees made their old protest music. I took the dog to the river path, the shallow one where the water talks to rocks in a voice that doesn't sound like anyone you know. I stood on the footbridge and watched a brown trout rise in a gentle boil to a bug so small I had to pretend I could see it. The dog leaned into my leg and sighed. I don't own a fly rod. I thought about buying one. I didn't. The next time I went back to Osprey, it was not because I wanted to say goodbye, and not because I wanted to say hello. It was because the lake and I had already said both, and were now in the part after that, where you still live where you live. The launch had 3 trucks at it, and a kid with a bicycle was throwing pebbles in from the dock and apologizing to no one for making rings. I said hello to the old man in the hat with the patches, and he said something about the bite being off early but maybe turning on with the wind. I nodded and meant it, and also didn't. Because there is the talk you do, and then there is the talk the line does, and I was tuned for the second. I didn't go to the arm right away. I looped the outer points. I made casts at laydowns where smallmouth might be, because that's sane behavior. I missed a hit and called it a perch. The sun was high and clumsy. The lake wore that glass look like it wasn't sure which side of the sky it liked better. Then I went to the arm. Then I let the motor die. Then I drifted. I didn't tie on a jig or a spinner. I tied on a bare hook and a split shot. I don't know why. It felt honest. The hook flashed in the air like punctuation. It hit the water with no ripple. The line lay flat and took on a direction of its own. I didn't set. I didn't pull. I didn't do anything. I let the line tell me what to be. I could feel the weight pick up. Not heavy, not light. The kind of weight a hand puts in yours when you're not supposed to shake it, because that would be too formal, and not supposed to pat it, because that would be too much. The weight said, "This is the hand we have." It said, "You could stop now." It said, "You could hold this another second and stop doing anything else for once and see what happens when you don't try to own the moment." I don't know how long I sat there. The dog wasn't with me. The boy on the dock probably had his supper already. The old man was likely napping with his mouth open, hat on his chest. The wind tried once and then gave up. My hands didn't shake. The line hummed without sound. If you've ever listened to your pulse against a pillow, you know how your body can make a noise the air can't hold. When I finally lifted the rod, it was not to haul anything up. It was to meet it halfway. The line tightened and the shape rose. Not the rope arm, not the pail sleeve. Something else they make out of what you bring. It was the handle of a net. It was the rubbery basket of a net. It was my hand on the net the morning years ago when I reached for a fish. And my brother said easy, which he said the same way he said hello. And I moved too quick anyway. It was the encouragement in his count off the stern when we tied the boat off to the old cleat on the dam. It was the way he held the back of my jacket when I leaned out and he said, "I've got you." And he moved his hand a little lower because he knew my shoulders make the fabric pull weird, and he never made a thing of it. When the shape touched the surface, the braid laid itself along the water. It let go. The hook came back empty and bright. The split shot tapped the rod tip like a bead. I reeled in and retied for the third time. Not because I needed to, because I wanted to feel my fingers do a knot from start to finish and know what we were talking about when we said hold. The knot sat neat. I cut the tag end close and watched the little piece of line slip off my knee onto the aluminum and then blow off into the lake. I didn't try to catch it. I don't have a clean end for you. I have a line that keeps running under the surface of everything I do. And some days it pulls, and some days it lies there. And the only thing that moves is me. I have a boat with a fractional dent in the bow where the anchor struck it and left a mark you can feel in the dark with your fingernail. I have a dog who follows me from room to room like he's towing me by something I can't see. I have cuts on my fingers, and I have the same lake, and I have the same hands, and I have the knowledge that the lake isn't mine and never was. But the piece of it that knocks the hull at night in my head is not going to stop just because I say so. I fish early now, and I go home before the wind gets mean. I keep the anchor line coiled perfect, not because it matters, but because I want to make one thing a circle. I talk to my brother sometimes, not like a prayer or a ghost story, but like a man who is working with a knot and says to the person he wishes were there, "I'm going to tuck this tag back under the last loop so it won't pull." And if I feel the line warm a little against my palm, if I feel it tug just enough to say I'm here, I answer. I don't jerk. I don't force it. I don't pretend it isn't happening. I give a little pressure back, then I let go. Sometimes it pulls after that. A steady pull that could take me somewhere I've already been and can't describe without sounding like I'm trying to make you stand on cold aluminum and like it. Other times, it doesn't. On those days, I tie on a spinner and throw at shadows that can't hold fish yet, and I miss one, and I tell myself it was a perch, and I tell myself I'm lying, and I go in and I wash my hands, and the water smells like copper and old leaves, and I sleep a little. Not much. Enough. Enough to get back out. Enough to feel the line again without mistaking it for instructions. One evening, late summer, the reeds were up and dragonflies stitched the air, and the world had that calm old lake smell like damp wood and the ghosts of campfires ground into dirt by sandals. I didn't go out. I sat on the bank with the dog and threw a stick for him in the shallows and apologized to no one for making rings. Across the lake, an osprey cut the water and lifted and shook itself, throwing a hoop of droplets in a halo around its body. For a second, I felt like the lake had let me belong. Then I felt stupid for wanting that. I felt the tug then, while I was on shore, clean and not clean at the same time, originating from nowhere my hands could explain. It was in my wrist where you feel your pulse. It was in the skin between thumb and forefinger that you tighten against the rod. It said nothing. It was enough. I smiled and the dog came back and pressed his wet head against my shoulder and sighed, and I smelled lake and dog and silt and a little engine gas on my shirt from months of launch mornings, and I put my hand down into the water up to the wrist, and the surface remembered the shape of me and gave it back, and under my palm the lake was warm, not because of the sun, not because of the air, warm like a person. Then a carp bumped my boot, and I jerked and laughed like a fool, and the dog barked, and we both spooked a wayward frog, and it sprung and smacked the surface, and made a ring that went out and out until it joined 100 other rings. And I thought, not fancy, not metaphysical, just a plain sentence that sat right down in me and made the chair steadier. The line is still there. It's mine to hold or let go. The next morning I went out with a new spool of braid. I tied it on slow. I put a finger against the spool to feel the line warm as it stacked perfectly. I watched the tiny green cord bite into the dark of the spool and felt like I was writing something in a language I'd never learned but could always try to read. The lake looked different and exactly the same. I pushed off. The hull whispered. The motor coughed and settled. The dog whined once, wanting to come, and then lay down with a grumble that said he forgave me. I told nobody where I was going. I didn't lie about it either. I just went. When the first fish of the day took, it was small and angry, and so alive it made my arms feel better just to hold it. I let it go, and it paused. Of course it paused. And then it started down, and I thought, there are worse things than a pause. There are worse things than a pull. There is only this, what you feel in your hand, and what you do with it. I watched it disappear without telling it not to. I made another cast. The line laid itself out like a promise I could keep or not. And for once, for a little while, it didn't feel like it was tied to anything I had to outrun. It felt like a length of green between two living places. And that was all. And that was good. And that was enough.